Over 1 year ago, as we made our pilgrimage into the heart of Leyndell, and later the Erdtree, we were faced with a stark realization. Marika is Radagon. Radagon is Marika. They are one and the same. The implications this has for the story as a whole is massive, and has been one of the most hotly debated topics within the Elden Ring community. How long have the two been merged? Were they always one being? And why? Radagon is a fascinating character, and arguably is one of the most influential figures in recent Lands Between history. His beliefs, actions and teachings have shaped the world that we find ourselves in, for better and for worse. He isn't the one-tone character many believe him to be. He is at the core of Elden Ring's thematic identity, and his relation to Marika is perhaps one of the most important relationships of all. Understanding Radagon is to understand Marika and the Elden Ring. So join me this week as we examine the story of Radagon, Second Elden Lord, and Champion of the Golden Order. At the onset of this video, I would also like to acknowledge some great content creators, whose work has greatly influenced my fundamental understanding of the subject matter that we're talking about today, namely Tarnished Archaeologist, Quailag, Zyostorm, and Last Protagonist. I would also like to thank Loki, translator and author of Abyssal Archive, for providing their translations and insights throughout. And remember that if you like Elden Ring lore, then consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. One of the most interesting things about Radagon is how suddenly he appears in the lore, yet already in a prestigious position. The first instance of him appearing in the timeline is during the two wars of Liurnia, and we know that he took part in both of these wars, thanks to the description of Barrier of Gold, which reads, "This incantation was used by the champions of the Erdtree in the First and Second Liurnian Wars, during which the red-haired Radagon joined the heroes' ranks. This was a hard-fought war between the royal Carian house and the royal house of the Erdtree. We know that the Carian knights led a fierce resistance against the forces of Leyndell, as the Carian Knight Sword reads, "These knight swords could serve as catalysts, letting them wield sorcerous battle skills. Despite numbering fewer than 20, this power made them a match for even the champions of gold in battle." But why is Radagon, a character that is never mentioned before this point in the lore, the one who is leading the said champions of gold? This ultimately leads us to the inevitable question that Miriel himself asks: who is Radagon? Well, I would like to state my thesis at the onset of this video. I believe that Radagon has never existed as a singular entity. As long as he has existed as part of Marika. But with that said, I acknowledge that there are two main theories that are valid. The first is that Radagon was his own individual person, a labourer who is descended from the giants. And the second theory is the one that I presented, that he is a being created from Marika herself, and has always been a part of her. And of course this is the one that I'm more inclined to believe. However, in this opening chapter I want to discuss both of these theories, as I do acknowledge there is strength to both of them. So let's explore theory 1, that Radagon was once his own person, who was later merged with Marika. And one of the potential sources for this theory comes from the Brick Hammer. Its item description reads the following: weapon made from an ordinary stone brick, wielded by a labourer who led a rebellion, and later became a champion himself. Even among other bludgeons of its size, this weapon is especially weighty. The strength of a giant is required to wield it. So I think it's hard to deny that you could easily see this as a reference to Radagon, and it could be a hint at his earlier life. The references to a champion, a hammer, and the strength of giants, all terms that can make one think of Radagon. At the time of the Liurnian Wars, Radagon is referred to as a champion by Miriel, and so one could think this is a reference to his time as a champion of the Erdtree. Then there is the hammer association. His other half, Marika, also wields a hammer, and Radagon faces off against us with Marika's hammer in hand in the final battle. Finally, there is the reference to a giant's strength, and again this could make us think of Radagon because of the references made to Radagon and giants in the giant's red braid. So let's put all that together and present some kind of narrative that could plausibly explain Radagon's origin had he existed as an individual prior to being merged with Marika, and this hammer is indeed referencing him. It states that this person was a labourer with the strength of a giant, and indeed we know there are humans who are suspected to have been descendants of the giants. The Northerner appearance preset reads, "A face found among the hard people of the unforgiving north. Some say they are descended from giants." So plausibly we could say that Radagon was one of these people, a Northerner suspected of being descended from the giants, but his potential lineage was even more clearly on display, not just via his strength, but via his red hair, the red hair of the fire giants. As described by the giant's red braid, Radagon supposedly hated his hair because of the association with the fire giants, and we can presume it's because he didn't want the stigmatism of being associated with the Erdtree Society's greatest enemy, and the fact this character is referred to as a labourer maybe implies that he is more of a lower class, maybe because of his heritage, though we are just speculating and riffing here. This hammer is found in Stormveil, a fortress of Godfrey's people, and perhaps Radagon began as a lowly labourer in this fortress, under the people who conquered and enslaved his giant ancestors, and he was reduced to this position because of his apparent ancestry, and thus he learned to loathe his red hair because it was the source of his poor treatment. The Brickhammer also describes that this person led a rebellion, and so this labourer, Radagon, could have led a rebellion and uprising of other people who were being maltreated under this order. We don't have any further information than that, apart from that at some stage he became a champion, perhaps recognised and rewarded for his courage rather than punished. While I do find this narrative quite compelling and exciting, I am still of the opinion that Radagon was most likely never an individual himself, and is simply the male aspect of Marika, a persona created upon her becoming a god, and a result of the Elden Ring's influence, which she is a vessel for. There is of course the possibility that this hammer isn't a reference to Radagon at all. It is found in Stormveil, a location that has absolutely no association with Radagon usually. When I discussed this subject with Loki, they suggested that the reference of giant-like strength is more likely an allusion to the earlier age that Godfrey lived in, as the Giant Crusher uses a similar language when describing people of this earlier period, as it reads, "After the giants were quelled, and man turned against man in violence, this weapon was all but forgotten. Man has grown feeble in comparison to his forebears." So there is a good chance that this hammer, the Brickhammer, is merely referencing an unrelated rebel of this period, when people were simply stronger. In addition, the reference to champion, found in the Brickhammer's description, may not be as strong as initially thought. Again, I referred this to Loki, and in the original Japanese, the term used for champion, Eiyu, is quite generic, and is used numerous times in the Japanese script. To name but a few, it is used in relation to the Zaemor, who are named as heroes of the Great War in the same language, the champions that Margit fought via his cloak description, and in the beast champion armour as well. So it is a fairly generic term, and thus is quite likely just a hammer, referring to an unrelated rebel hero of Godfrey's time. I will leave it up to you to decide what is your truth. But with that said, I would like to discuss my main theory, that is that Radagon has always been a part of Marika, born from her soul due to the influence of the Elden Ring. That is what I will argue for the majority of this video, but please bear in mind that even if I accepted that Radagon was once an individual, I would still argue that he became part of Marika before his marriage to Rennala, and you will understand the reasoning why as this video continues. So a good starting point for my main theory that Radagon was born of Marika is the giant's red braid, which reads the following: "Every giant is red of hair, and Radagon was said to have despised his own red locks. Perhaps that was a curse of their kind." Again, for clarity, I don't think when it says perhaps this was a curse of their kind that it's suggesting that Radagon was a giant. Rather, I believe that it's saying that the red hair is a curse of the giant's kind. And to clarify the intention of this, Loki was kind enough to provide their translation of this item from the original Japanese, and that translation reads as follows: "The giants all uniformly have red hair, and it is said that Radagon despaired at his own red hair. Was it a giant's curse?" What is interesting about this item description is that it implies that Radagon was aware of the fire giants, and if he hated being associated with them to have such strong feelings about it, of hatred, then he must have been close to this event somehow. In my discussions with Loki, they suggested that Radagon's hatred for the giants might be second-hand, and that it comes from Marika, his progenitor and other half, and I totally agree. Indeed, Marika clearly does have a hatred of giants, as is evidenced by her pre-battle speech on the eve of the War of the Giants.
"Put the giants to the sword and confine the flame atop the mount. Let a new epoch begin, an epoch glistening with life."
And we see this hatred in her cruel treatment of the final fire giant, as the giant's remembrance reads the following: "The fire giant is a survivor of the war against the giants. Upon realizing the flames of their forge would never die, Queen Marika marked him with a curse. O trifling giant, mayest thou tend thy flame for eternity." So Marika brutally slaughters the giants, leaving one amongst the graveyard of his people for an eternity of torment. And it is one of the cruelest acts of Marika's reign that we learn in her lore. Would it then not make sense that Radagon's intense dislike of the giants comes from his other half, Marika, that her hatred coalesced into Radagon and resulted in him having an innate revulsion for the giants? But is this when Radagon came into being, at the end of the War of the Giants, not only tinged by a hatred for them, but also touched by their pigmentation? My gut feeling is that Radagon was created, or came into being, when Marika became a god, when she became a vessel for the Elden Ring, and he is a product of its influence, and I will explain why in the next chapter. But before we do so, I want to start by discussing some of the other common theories surrounding Radagon, and this is not to say that I am 100% right, and please leave your thoughts below. Rather, I just want to lay a more solid foundation for this discussion. The most common theories that I see is that they became one, Radagon and Marika, when they married, or that they merged during the shattering of the Elden Ring. Both these theories posit that they were both different individuals that became merged during a certain event. Like I have stated, I don't believe Radagon was ever his own person. To me, he is a reflection of Marika, the god, and thus I don't accept that they were two individuals who became conjoined. Firstly, the theory that they became one during the shattering of the Elden Ring is centered around a certain dialogue, a dialogue that Melina recreates for us in the Queen's bedchamber, where she says the following:
"O Radagon, leal hound of the Golden Order, thou art yet to become me. Thou art yet to become a god. Let us be shattered, both, mine other self."
Many interpret the line, "thou art yet to become me," to mean that they were separate people who were soon to become one. And yet I've never read it that way, and people who argue this theory also overlook another line in this speech, where she says, let us be shattered both, mine other self. Radagon, to me, is already her other self at this stage, and the reason she says, thou art yet to become me, is because they are still two separate personalities, able to distinguish themselves from the other despite sharing a body, and ultimately it is Marika who is the dominant form, the god form, not Radagon, and that is what she is chastising him for here, but we will get into that shortly. Again, clarity on this matter can be found in the original Japanese, and thanks to Loki, we have access to it. In Loki's translation of this speech, what I am implying is a bit clearer, and I quote that translation now. O Radagon, dog of the golden regulation, you are still not me, still not God. Still not God. I think that still is an important qualifier, again implying that despite them sharing a body, and Radagon having gained power and influence, it is Marika who is the god form, not Radagon. I also think that Marika and Radagon were one even before they got married, before Radagon became Second Elden Lord. My main reasons for believing so are what I see as quite blatant hints surrounding the lore of his marriage to Rennala, that lead me to conclude that he was already one with Marika, at least as far back as his first marriage. So let's discuss it. The first thing we need to consider is the very purpose of Radagon's marriage to Rennala. The reasoning behind the union is given to us via the relevant sword monument, which reads, "The Second Liurnian War, no victory for the Golden, nor for the Moon, no prize but atonement, the birth of a vow." So this war clearly resulted in a stalemate, the mighty armies of Leyndell clearly unable to break the defences of the magically supported Carian forces. Instead, an alliance is formed between the two, as is told to us by Meriel, who says,
Radagon once cleansed himself with celestial dew, repented his territorial aggressions, and swore his love to Rennala. The order of the Erdtree and the fate of the moon were conjoined, and all the wounds of war forgiven. This miracle blesses the Church to this day.
So what am I getting at here by presenting this quote? Well, again, I do have to give Loki credit for making a keen observation in our discussions regarding this video. And the point that they raised was, why is Radagon a representative of the royal house? If he is a random champion, then how does his marriage to Rennala join these two royal households? To me, the reasoning is clear. Marika is Radagon, the most royal of blood. For if that is not the case, and they were individual people, then what relevance does Radagon have to this marriage? How is he binding the two houses together? And this was a nuance that Loki brought to my attention by suggesting that perhaps Radagon was presented as a cousin to Marika, or else another minor royal, but this is a cover, of course, for his true identity. The point being, we don't get any reference to Radagon's relevance to the royal family, or why he is so important. He just is. He just appears at the head of the Leyndell army one day, as Meriel specifically says that Radagon was at the head of the Leyndell army. So who is this guy suddenly leading the forces of the Erdtree in an important conflict? I've always found it very stark that he just kind of appears at the head of the army at this point in the timeline. We get nothing about his position, who he is, whether he's a general. We get nothing of his backstory or the lead up to this moment. Aside from that, we also have to consider Meriel's account of how the Liurnian War came to a close, as he says,
Lord Radagon was a great champion, possessed of flowing red locks. He came to these lands at the head of a great golden host. When he met Lady Rennala in battle, he soon repented his territorial aggressions there, and became husband to the Carian queen.
So Radagon repented his territorial aggressions. What right does Radagon, a mere champion, have in order to make such massive political and military decisions? Why is he the one that decides that this war can end, and that the royal family of the Erdtree can incorporate these moon worshippers and make an alliance with them. Indeed, Meriel even pointedly questions the importance of Radagon.
The mystery endures to this day as to why Lord Radagon would cast Lady Rennala aside, and moreover, why a mere champion would be chosen for the seat of Elden Lord.
Why, out of all the potential suitors in the world, was Radagon a mere and seemingly random champion chosen, especially when he was already in an important political marriage? The question posed by Meriel is too heavy-handed and pointed to ignore, and serves no other purpose than to have the player question Radagon's identity. If you believe that Radagon only became merged with Marika later, either via marriage or during the Shattering, then this question posed by Meriel serves no narrative purpose. The suspicion planted into the player's mind is further inflamed by Meriel's following remarks that come just after this question, where he says,
You know, it's said that Lord Radagon harboured a secret. A famed sculptor of the Erdtree capital was once summoned to render Lord Radagon's likeness in giant stature, when he glimpsed the skeleton in Radagon's closet. And as such, it's said the great statue harbours his secret too.
This secret is obviously that Marika is Radagon, given that Meriel is referring to the statue in Leyndell that can shift form between Marika and Radagon. This is obviously the skeleton in the closet. While of course the sculpting of the two-form statue was carved after their marriage and Radagon became Elden Lord, the fact that it is said in the same breath as Meriel's prior statements on Radagon's identity suggests that this is the answer to why a mere champion was chosen to be Elden Lord, because Radagon was Marika even at this time. Indeed, there is further sources of potential evidence that Radagon was already Marika during his first marriage to Rennala. One strong bit of evidence for me comes from the Mask of Confidence, the masks worn by the preceptors of the Carian royals. The item reads the following. When Radagon married Rennala, he ordered the Carian magic preceptors to don these masks, to make it clear that all of their matters were to be kept strictly private. Preceptors, as we know from their armour set, are astrologers and sorcerers who attended the Carian royals, their name of preceptor implying that they probably tutor younger members of the family, interpret fate, and advise the royals. At least that is my interpretation of their role. Again, I find this a very unsubtle nod to Radagon's great secret. Yes, it could simply be a case of a leader wanting his political dealings kept private, but it's also disingenuous to say that there isn't a pattern forming around lore regarding Radagon. There's always a reference to a secret, or there are questions about his identity. And for me, most clearly, this Mask of Confidence is another nod towards Radagon's true identity, and that the secret that these preceptors, close advisors to Rennala, were keeping was that Radagon was Marika, as they will have witnessed the truth being so close to the royal family. There is one final piece of evidence that leads me to believe that he was part of Marika even at his time of the marriage to Rennala, and this is the Amber Egg. Again, this artifact, one that Rennala holds tightly, is something that Meriel comments on.
In the end, Lady Rennala was left alone, cradling the amber egg Lord Radagon bequeathed her.
This Amber Egg, this artifact, is a rune from the Elden Ring itself, as the description of the Great Rune of the Unborn reads, Amber Egg clutched by Rennala, Queen of the Full Moon, Great Rune of Unborn Demigods. So again, the question needs to be asked, how did Radagon, a mere champion, manage to procure a fragment of the very Elden Ring as a parting gift to his first wife? Well, the most obvious answer to all of these questions I've posed is that Radagon has always been Marika, Marika being the only person who could feasibly access the Elden Ring and provide Rennala with a great rune fragment of it. If you disagree with the assessment, please let me know in your comments below with your reasoning. I always do enjoy discussing lore with the community. And so, to return to the thesis of this video, I don't believe that Radagon ever existed as his own individual. But that also doesn't mean he isn't his own individual character that had his own goals and aims and philosophy, which clearly was the case. But ultimately, the big reveal of the two-form statue in Leyndell and its message is that Radagon is Marika. They aren't two different people, they are the same being. Two different personalities of an Immortal Rebis, a being that is simultaneously both male and female. Both he and Marika are distinct personalities, or halves, of the same being, constituent parts of an Immortal Rebis. But what is a Rebis, and what can it tell us about their story? Well, let's talk about that. The why is a big question when it comes to Radagon. Why is he part of Marika? Even if you don't agree with my assessment that they were always the same person, there is still that question as to why. What is even the point of this thematic point in the story? In my discussions with Loki regarding this subject, Loki suggests that Radagon was created as part of her to spite Marika after she thwarted the Godskin god hunts, seeing him as a more reliable hound to keep her in line than Maliketh. However, I'm more of the belief that Radagon was formed so that Marika could become an alchemical Rebis, the perfect being and perfect custodian for the Elden Ring. This is just my theory, however, and as you can see from Loki's suggestion, there are plenty of compelling arguments to be made, so please let me know yours in the comments below, and just bear in mind what follows is my speculative theory. As I mentioned, an Immortal Rebis is an alchemical concept. It is the magnum opus of the field, a divine and perfect form, to quote Wikipedia. Sometimes described as the divine hermaphrodite, a reconciliation of spirit and matter, a being of both male and female qualities, as indicated by the male and female head, within a single body. The Rebis is the reunification and reconciliation of opposing matter, including the male and female, to create the perfect immortal being, a unity of all. Perfect in so much that it encompasses everything, spirit and matter. And does this not sound perfect for a being who would be a god and vessel for the cosmic Elden Ring? In basic terms, alchemy is quite often the process of combining and mixing elements, but much of it is described in an allegorical fashion. Now, while I have commented on the idea of the Rebis before, namely in my Marika video, there is another facet to this idea that I didn't comment on. Zyostorm, in a video called Elden Ring is an Allegory for Alchemy, makes a keen reference to the Red King and the White Queen, the two constituent parts of the Divine Rebis. The relevance to Radagon, the red-haired, and Marika, the white-haired, should be obvious, so credit to Zyostorm for bringing to my attention this particular detail. The concept of the White Queen and Red King is an allegorical description, and to quote an article from Learn Religion, the union of the Red King and White Queen is often called the chemical marriage, their marriage that will eventually lead to an allegorical offspring, the Rebis. Descriptions of alchemical processes often describe the reactions of sulfur and mercury. The Red King is sulfur, the active, volatile, and fiery principle, while the White Queen is Mercury, the material, passive, fixed principle. Mercury has substance but has no definitive form on its own. Even before the Red King and White Queen aspect had been brought to my attention, when I first discovered the truth about Marika and Radagon, I immediately considered them to be a Rebis, mainly because it is meant to be the perfect being. But Zyostorm's analysis goes further into this by looking at the analogous King and Queen, and how it can be used to assess the role of both Radagon and Marika. As you saw from the passage I just quoted, the White Queen is the more passive, fixed, and material aspect of the equation, and of course the female element of the Rebis. This does somewhat match with Marika in her distant and cold way of rulership, but also the White Queen is the material, the vessel, and ultimately that is Marika's role, to be the vessel for the Elden Ring.
Queen Marika is the vessel of the Elden Ring, carrier of its vision.
What I do also find interesting is that one of the alchemical symbols for Mercury cleaves very closely to the form of Marika's rune, whereas sulphur, seen as the more active and aggressive part of the Rebis, as well as the masculine, is the element that causes change. We can somewhat see this in Radagon, who in general seems to be far more involved in the world, from fighting in the Liurnian Wars to developing the Golden Order. To go further, I would like to quote another article from Catherine Bayer, who was also the author of the article I quoted just a moment ago. In a separate article, Catherine says the following of this alchemical relationship. While sulphur causes change, it needs something to actually shape and change in order to accomplish anything. This contrasts with Mercury, Marika, who is the passive but material aspect that the sulphur aspect will act upon, and indeed by the end of the game, devoid of her Radagon half, Marika is just that, passive and material, a hollowed out clay husk that houses the Elden Ring. Only the Mercury, the passive material, remains after the Radagon half is killed. So I hope you are still following after that dive into alchemy, but let us now try and unpack the potential ramifications for Marika's character. Firstly, because Marika is the material half, I consider her to be the host or the original character of this Rebis. And this does make sense given we learn more about her past and history than we do of Radagon. Marika was once a Numen who was elected Empyrean, and we learn the former from the Numen rune, which reads, "The Numen are said to have come from outside the lands between, and are in fact of the same stock as Queen Marika herself." And we learn the latter, about her Empyrean status, from Maliketh's remembrance, which reads, "Maliketh was a Shadowbound Beast given to his Empyrean." The Numen are an unusual race that we know very little about. Indeed, their appearance preset states, "The face of the Numen, supposed descendants of denizens of another world, long-lived but seldom born." In my Marika lore video, we were able to uncover some more depth about these beings in detail, thanks to the work of fellow content creator and translator Last Protagonist. In English, the Black Knife Assassin armor names them as Numen. However, when Last Protagonist looked at the original Japanese, he noted that the term Maribito was used instead. Wikipedia says the following on Maribito. Maribito is an ancient Japanese word referring to a supernatural being who comes from afar, bringing gifts of wisdom, spiritual knowledge, and happiness. The term refers to any one of a number of divine beings who were believed to visit villages in Japan, either from beyond the horizon or from beyond distant mountain ranges, bringing gifts. So the Numen are potential humanoid descendants of supernatural beings who come from another world, meaning we don't necessarily know what is the norm for these Numen. Perhaps they are all like Marika, perfect beings that are formed of two halves, and perhaps this is why they live long lives and rarely reproduce. However, I don't believe this, as there isn't any other evidence that other Numen hold this as a part of their identity. It isn't mentioned anywhere else, and the Marika Radagon secret is treated as a really unique situation. Had it been the norm for her people, then I'm sure it wouldn't have been described as Radagon's skeleton in his closet. Rather, it would have been expected as part of a Numen queen. Therefore, I believe Marika's status as a Rebis must be related to her godhood, and her becoming the vessel for the Elden Ring. We can see that Marika literally bears the Elden Ring within her at the end of the game, and Anea says that she is the vessel for the Elden Ring. And it's hard to imagine that a normal, ordinary being could bear such a cosmic force. Thus, I speculate that the Immortal Rebis was created upon her ascension as god, and that she was reformed by the power of the Elden Ring as the perfect being, a god to oversee a new era of order. I believe that Marika is the original being as we learn more about her, as I've said, pre-godhood than we do of Radagon. Radagon just kind of appears in the narrative. We at least know that she was of the Numen people and once an Empyrean. And aside from that, in regards to the alchemical allegory, she is the material, she is the substance, meaning she is the flesh and blood, and Radagon, to my mind, is the active element that was added later, and that he would have his own role to play in their guardianship of the Elden Ring. I do find it interesting that Goldmask, when attempting to complete a calculus that interprets the Elden Ring's true nature, he is confounded when Radagon's name comes up in his reflections.
The Master's reflections had heightened as we neared the Erdtree, while still a precise calculus. The rhythms grew increasingly wild, until he simply ceased. Now the Master is facing quite the puzzle. The Golden Order is founded on the principle that Marika is the one true god. However, the name of Marika's second husband, King Consort Radagon, also appeared. Who exactly was Radagon?
The answer to his question is that Radagon and Marika are one.
To think that Radagon was Marika herself, or at least such is all I can interpret from the rhythm and calculus of his finger. How would such a thing even have been possible, I wonder? Sadly, I cannot comprehend it myself.
And the fact that Goldmask came across it during his reflections and calculus of the Elden Ring suggests it could be some kind of formula embedded within the Elden Ring itself. Now, I do appreciate this is complete speculation, and we aren't meant to fully comprehend the makeup of such a cosmic artifact, but I do take this as further evidence that Marika's condition as a Rebis is the result of the Elden Ring's influence, if Goldmask himself can detect this truth within his calculations of the Elden Ring. Marika and Radagon are very much an eldritch being beyond our comprehension, for what else could literally bear the Elden Ring within them? As I have noted in prior videos, not only does Marika Radagon bear the Elden Ring, they are literally one with the Elden Ring. This is why Marika says,
"Let us be shattered, both, mine other self."
Because not only is the Elden Ring shattered, but Marika's body also shatters, hence the massive cracks throughout her body, and you see this more clearly in the announcement trailer, as the cracks stretch down her back as she does shatter the Elden Ring. She has become one with this unknowable artifact. So to reiterate, the Immortal Rebis is something truly beyond our comprehension, as is the Elden Ring itself, and as we will later discuss in this video, the few beings that have connected with the will of Radagon and Marika are left overwhelmed and terrified. I think this is why Malenia's remembrance implies that both she and Miquella were meant to be the perfect children. They are born from the Rebis, or as the remembrance calls them, the single-bodied god, and we will touch on their relevance later in this video as well. But either way, Radagon isn't mentioned at all until the Liurnian Wars, a war I don't consider to have taken place until the later age of the Erdtree, because the Barrier of Gold incantation, which describes this event, uses the Erdtree sigil rather than the ancient Erdtree sigil of the earlier Age of Plenty. And as always, credit to Tarnished Archaeologist for his Erdtree incantations timeline, that we will get into shortly. So to conclude, I believe that the Radagon personality was gestated from Marika when she was crowned as god, hence why he seemingly appears out of nowhere in a prestigious position. He is the active masculine aspect of Marika, born to provide a specific function for the immortal Elden Ring bearing Rebis. Radagon would in time develop his own personality, goals and ideologies, a fascinating split that would culminate in Radagon and Marika's disagreement over the fate of the Elden Ring. In many ways, Radagon would become more influential in time, especially in later history, as evidenced by the abundance of his statuary, and by his red hair being revered as a sign of pedigree amongst his children. With all that said, let us talk about the history of Radagon and his acts in the lands between. So, following the aforementioned theory, Radagon would become the active component to the royal godly Rebis, and as such would lead Marika's forces in a major conflict, the Liurnian Wars. It is never specifically mentioned as to why Radagon repented his aggressions, or why he decided to make an alliance with the Carian royals, but I get the impression that he fell in love with Rennala.
Radagon once cleansed himself with celestial dew, repented his territorial aggressions, and swore his love to Rennala.
And B, he saw the value in the Carians after they had so fiercely resisted him. That is just my speculation, of course. But it does become clear that Radagon certainly saw value in the Carian ways of sorcery and intelligence, as he took the opportunity of being married to Rennala to become a more complete leader, by studying their ways. We learn of this via the Radagon icon, which reads, "As the husband of Rennala of Caria, the red-haired Radagon studied sorcery, and as the husband of Queen Marika, he studied incantations. Thus did the hero aspire to be complete." This really is the first instance of Radagon developing as something more than just a champion of gold, and sows the seeds for his interpretation of the Golden Order, and ultimately his eventual disagreement with Marika. One final aspect of this icon that's really interesting to me is that it says the hero aspire to be complete. This means that Radagon did have his own aspirations and later beliefs, again reinforcing what I said in the prior chapters, that while Radagon may have been a part of Marika, he also developed his own personality and his own mind. They are still separate personalities despite sharing a soul and body. Perhaps the most important aspect of Radagon's marriage to Rennala is his children, Rykard, Radahn and Ranni. Each of these figures would become massive players in the years to come, and if we consider that Radagon was already an aspect of the single-bodied god, then their extreme power levels certainly make sense. We unfortunately don't get much information on the relationship between Radagon and his children with Rennala, but we know that his two sons seem to hold their lineage to him in high regards. We know from Radahn's breastplate that he was a great admirer of Godrey, First Elden Lord, but he was equally proud of being descended from his father, as the red mane became an iconic part of his imagery, as we see via the red mane helm, which reads, "The red plume is a symbol of Radahn's pedigree as Lord Radagon's son, the mane of the proud red lion, the red lion combining Godfrey's and Radagon's symbolism, the red hair of Radagon, and the lion of Godrey." Likewise, Rykard's knights, the Gelmir knights, also celebrate this pedigree, and I do think it is a good indicator of how well regarded Radagon was. So great that his sons would try and hold on to that lineage, as if his prestige would elevate theirs as well. No doubt claiming lineage to him would also help have legitimised their claim to the throne when the Shattering broke out. Of course, as we have already discussed, one of the main impacts of his marriage would be political, to bind the two royal houses together and incorporate the Carian household, along with their forces and ideals. Having Caria and Liurnia effectively brought into the fold is a massive win for the Erdtree royalty. As part of his marriage pact with the Full Moon Queen, he will have received a legendary sword, a Full Moon Greatsword, and we know of this tradition thanks to the description of the Dark Moon Greatsword, which reads, "A moon greatsword bestowed by a Carian queen upon her spouse to honour long-standing tradition." As this blade is given to us by Ranni of the Dark Moon, we can presume that Radagon will have received a Full Moon Greatsword from Rennala. This is what has led many to believe that the Golden Order Greatsword, one wielded by the Misbegotten Crusader, was once a Full Moon Greatsword, as its description reads, "Greatsword made of light, modelled after the Elden Ring itself, forged by King Consort Radagon to proudly symbolise the tenets of the Golden Order. Telltale signs portray that this was once the greatsword bequeathed to him by his first wife, Rennala. What is interesting is he seemingly transformed the sword to reflect his conception of the Golden Order, its tenets made manifest in the form of the Elden Ring itself. I find this interesting because it gives further evidence that Radagon slowly developed his own philosophy surrounding the Golden Order, and what form it should take. Even symbolically, this sword represents Radagon taking something Carian as the foundation and transforming it to serve as a basis for his new ideology. It cannot be overstated how important Radagon's time as a Carian consort was, how it developed his philosophy and character. The Golden Order fundamentalists really are the ruling faction by the time we enter the scene, and it is because of Radagon's understanding of both faith and intelligence that their ideals would be codified. In the meantime, Godfrey's time would eventually run out as Elden Lord, a man of conflict ruling over a peacetime. Marika would tarnish her husband and banish him and his warriors from the lands between. Radagon would take the title of Second Elden Lord and everything would change. Marika marrying her other self seems very sudden, but perhaps both aspects of the Rebis felt it was the best choice for the current era they found themselves in. And so with that said, let us contextualise the era in which Radagon would rise to power by revisiting the earlier periods of this Erdtree epoch. The Age of Plenty / the Age of the Crucible is the earliest period of Erdtree history, a bountiful era that we hear of via the Blessed Dew talisman, which reads, "It was once thought that the blessed sap of the Erdtree would drip from its boughs forever, but that age of plenty swiftly came to a close, and with time, the Erdtree became more an object of faith." Tarnished Archaeologist in their astonishing Creeds of the Erdtree video comes up with a very coherent and compelling timeline of the age of the Erdtree, and I highly recommend you check out that video, as we will be heavily referencing their work in this chapter ahead. We mentioned this timeline briefly before, but basically, Tarnished Archaeologist organises the long epoch of the Erdtree into different eras, symbolised and represented by the evolution of Erdtree incantations that each possess a different insignia. As a result, Tarnished Archaeologist groups the age of the Erdtree into the following 3 eras. Firstly, there is the Age of the Ancient Erdtree, which encompasses the Age of Plenty and the Age of the Crucible. Then comes the Age of Erdtree Worship, and then the Age of the Golden Order Fundamentalists. Myself and others believe that Radagon was brought back at a time of need, a time of waning faith, the coming of which we will illustrate through Tarnished Archaeologist's excellent timeline. The incantations that display the Erdtree in its more wild and naturalistic form are deemed to be the ancient Erdtree incantations from the description of said incantations, such as we see in the descriptions of Erdtree Hail, Blessing's Boon, and Blessing of the Erdtree. This ancient Erdtree era is most certainly the Age of Plenty, as the Blessing of the Erdtree incantation reads, "The Erdtree once flourished with abundance, yet it was only for a fleeting moment. Such is the course of all life." And this period also encompasses that of the Crucible, as the Crucible incantations share the same incantation sigil. So grouping it together, Tarnished Archaeologist terms this earliest Erdtree era as the Ancient Erdtree period, an era represented by the natural tree itself, and the bounty which dropped freely from it, the Blessed Dew. We know that Godfrey also ruled in this era, not only from his association with the Crucible, but also he is tied to the bounty of the Age of Plenty, via the Amber Medallions, which contain the dried sap, or amber, of the Erdtree, and the description of these Amber Medallions describe them as being a prized object of Godfrey's rule. Yet both the Blessing of the Erdtree incantation and the Blessed Dew Talisman emphasise the fact that this period did not last very long. But why? Well, once again, Tarnished Archaeologist provides a compelling theory, evidence for which is found in the very streets of Leyndell. In Leyndell, even before we burn the Erdtree ourselves, there is a blanket of ash coating the streets, but the coverage of this ash even reaches the heights of Queen Marika's chamber. As Tarnished Archaeologist says, there can be little doubt of the source of this ash. There is only one object that looms high enough over Leyndell that it could distribute ash to even the highest points of Leyndell, the Erdtree. The Erdtree must have burned. When we ourselves burn the Erdtree, we see Leyndell blanketed under a similar, yet deep, blanket of ash. So if there was ash in Leyndell even before we burn the Erdtree, it leads us to one inevitable conclusion, that the Erdtree has been burned before we even entered the picture. Tarnished Archaeologist goes further and states that they believe that the ancient Erdtree was an actual true tree, and this is how it produced a literal bounty of dew, because it was a real arboreal tree. Indeed, the truth of this theory seems to be confirmed via the depictions of this tree on both the Blessed Dew Talisman and the Icon Shield. Both are objects that celebrate this age of plenty, and both unambiguously show a true natural tree. And this period came to an end swiftly because the original arboreal tree was burned, and in its place the Elden Ring resurrected a golden phantom tree, a tree only symbolically, not in function. Indeed, in the Elden Lord endings, the 4 different variants, we do spawn a new Erdtree, and that hue is dependent on the configuration of the Elden Ring we choose, implying that the Elden Ring is the source of said phantom, and that upon repairing it and constituting a new order, it produces a new Erdtree phantom. This would explain the description of the Blessed Dew Talisman that states, now the Erdtree is merely an object of faith, i.e. it went from being an actual functioning source of tangible benefit to a phantom replacement, an era where faith was more important, faith in the absence of tangible benefit. And this is where we enter Tarnished Archaeologist's proposed era of Erdtree faith, in which even the Celtic Circle-esque sigil of the Erdtree is less arboreal in its depiction, and using the incantation sigils of this period to date certain events, we can see from the Golden Barrier incantation that this is when the Wars of Liurnia would have taken place. And so as we leave the Tarnished Archaeologist timeline behind, I do just want to give final credit to Tarnished Archaeologist for the subjects we have just discussed, and the influence that this video has had on my work and understanding of the timeline cannot be understated, so do me a favour and check out their Creeds of the Erdtree video and give them a sub. With this new understanding in hand of the timeline, certain dialogues of Marika begin to make much more sense, such as the following.
I declare mine intent to search the depths of the Golden Order through understanding of the proper way. Our faith, our grace is increased. Those blissful early days of blind belief are long past. My comrades, why must ye falter?
This speech speaks of faltering belief. In the wake of such loss, the burning and loss of the original arboreal tree, many must have felt bereft of the tangible benefits the tree must have once given, before being replaced with this pale imitation. And regardless of what you think to be the source of the original tree's burning, witnessing such an event to the faithful would have been apocalyptic in scale, traumatic for those who had lived in the Erdtree's shadow for so long. This is no age for a warrior. One cannot slay a lack of faith with axe in hand, and so I see this as the era in which Godfrey and the Tarnished were banished. A new lord was needed, a thinker, a philosopher, a great unifier who could forge a new ideology to replace the loss of the Erdtree. Enter Radagon, Second Elden Lord. And I think Tarnished Archaeologist's theory contextualizes the need for Radagon quite clearly. Both Marika and Radagon should have recognised that Radagon's unifying theories that he was developing at Caria would have filled a much needed gap where the Erdtree once stood, and so he returned to the Erdtree capital and married his other self. This union would produce 2 children, Miquella and Malenia, both greatly flawed and yet almost unmatched in power and intellect respectively. And I can't help but see both of them as reflections of the Red King and White Queen, one with the mane of their mother and the other with the mane of their father. Perhaps had they been born as one being instead of 2, they truly would have been the perfect child, the auspicious birth that is hinted at in Malenia's remembrance. Yet Radagon's greatest legacy and obsession is of course the Golden Order. As we have discussed many times on this channel before, the Golden Order was created when death was confined, as evidenced by the description of the mending rune of the Death Prince, which reads as follows. The Golden Order was created by confining destined death. Thus this new order will be one of death restored. I think this is an important moment to try and understand the differences between the Golden Order as a ruling body and the Golden Order fundamentalists as an ideal. Rogier dates the Golden Order as far back as when Radagon first made peace with the Carians.
They were conceived at the Great Academy of Rea Lucaria, to the north of this castle. In the past, they obeyed laws which contravened the Golden Order, or so I'm told. Fascinating, isn't it? That the Golden Order was pliable enough to absorb practices that contradicted itself in the past. With the Order broken, twisted, and in need of repair, such adaptability is more important now than ever.
I believe the confinement of death, and thus the foundation of the Golden Order, took place following the Godskin apostasy, as evidenced by the description of the Godskin Apostle outfit, which describes the Rune of Death being confined after this event. It makes sense, of course, that after the destruction wrought by destined death at the hands of the Gloam-Eyed Queen and her apostles, that Marika would want the Rune of Death removed. And overall, this is a topic that I discuss in a far deeper way in my Gloam-Eyed Queen lore video, so I would direct you there. But what I am getting at is that the Golden Order was not invented by Radagon, rather it was a system and configuration of the Elden Ring that happened following the confinement of death. With a specific rune being removed, the Golden Order is both the ruling order but also the form of the Elden Ring. What Radagon developed is Golden Order fundamentalism. Fundamentalism in any religion is a particular sect or line of thought that adheres to a strict and literal interpretation of the scripture. Loki provides a translation of the original kanji used in place of fundamentalism throughout the script, and I quote them now. Fundamentalism, literally, original logic doctrine. Logic refers to principles of the universe. It is scholarship, a pseudo-religious philosophy that tries to understand the fundamentals of logic, order, and the rule of the universe. It concerns itself with the Elden Ring, order, and what is order, hence the absence of the Erdtree in any fundamentalist iconography. Radagon took the intelligence-based studies of the Carians and blended it with Erdtree faith, thus spawning fundamentalism, a new ideology that could fill the void left by the physical Erdtree's destruction, a tonic to an era of waning faith, and the balance of such studies is represented by Radagon's iconic pose, Golden Order totality. Radagon's age was one far different from that of Godfrey, an evolution from the primal combative era of the Crucible to one of refinement and more ordered society. We of course see this in the shuttering of the arenas. These arenas decorated with the lion emblem of Godfrey, and with architecture very unsightly compared to High Leyndell, clearly relics of this warrior's age. Such barbarism and bloodsport would not be welcome in Radagon's high culture. As the ritual shield talisman reads, a talisman patterned after shields used in ritual combat held to honour the Erdtree. The practice had died out by the age of King Consort Radagon. I have often credited Hawkshaw and their excellent video on colours for refining my understanding of this transition towards a more genteel society, and I must do so again now. In that video, Hawkshaw highlights the ruler's mask and its importance for highlighting the changing morals in terms of leadership between the age of the Crucible and Radagon's age of the Golden Order. The description of that item reads, "Such a mask illustrates the qualities of an ideal lord, chiefly wise, and possessing a certain defined geniality. One at the centre of society often finds these qualities most expedient." In general, Radagon's era is one of defanging that which came before, closing the arenas just to name one, but more generally, anything associated with the Crucible, this earlier era of the Erdtree, is considered crude, barbaric, violent, and has no place in the civilized society of the scholar like Radagon. At a philosophical level, this can be explained by the core tenets of Golden Order fundamentalism, the laws of causality and regression. Now, I do need to credit Last Protagonist in refining my understanding of these laws thanks to their excellent Golden Order law video. To quote the description of the law of regression incantation, it states, "Regression is the pool of meaning, that all things yearn eternally to converge." So Last Protagonist likens this regression to the statistical phenomena known as regression towards the mean, where extreme variables in a dataset get pulled closer and closer towards the average in each sampling. The example that Last Protagonist gives is that if two parents who are taller than average have a child, that child will most likely be shorter than they, regressing towards the mean. In regards to the Golden Order fundamentalists and their view on life following these laws, it means that life should be less chaotic and more uniform, hence convergence, a refinement of life with less chaotic aberrances, as represented by the Misbegotten and the Omen. And even the sigil of the Golden Order itself is more refined in its appearance than the chaotic arboreal tree of the ancient Erdtree era. But one other thing that's worth talking about when we're talking about regression towards the mean and the law of regression is what we discussed earlier in regards to Radagon and his relation to the Elden Ring itself and its form, in a way that we can't understand, but through their studies in calculus, these laws of regressions can be traced back to the Elden Ring itself. And so at this juncture I would like to quote something from Loki, who in their notes regarding this topic they said the following: "Radagon becomes consumed by his existential crisis, and is driven as much to understand and fix his incomplete existence through order." So what Loki is saying here is that Radagon's study of the Elden Ring and of order and its fundamentals is as much an attempt to understand himself as it is the universe. With that in mind, if we return to the idea of regression towards the mean and convergence, Radagon and Marika might make more sense. Earlier on in the video I did hint that the Elden Ring was responsible for Marika's transformation into this Rebis, for the creation of Radagon, and that is why Goldmask can detect Radagon within the Elden Ring and his calculations. And perhaps it is because this law of regression exists within the Elden Ring, and its influence upon Marika created a being that was the epitome of convergence, two personalities sharing one soul and one body. And perhaps this can explain the appearance of beings such as D and his twin. We learn of their true nature via the twinned armor set, which reads, "The two known as D are inseparable twins. They are of two bodies and two minds, but one single soul. Their sword, the inseparable sword, goes further and says that D and his twin were only accepted by the Golden Order, which makes sense given they are a reflection of these fundamental ideals." But if you do want to learn more about the ideals surrounding the Golden Order, convergence, causality, then please check out my Goldmask lore video. Returning to Radagon, when we last saw him, He was at Liurnia studying the works of Carians and the Academy to become a more balanced individual. He comes from an order of faith, born from the god of that order, yet here he is studying the other mysteries of the universe found in sorcery. However, it is clear that Radagon hadn't fully conceived of Golden Order fundamentalism in its totality, as we learn that Miquella, his son, would work together with him in forming the incantations that would be the backbone of Golden Order fundamentalism. For example, in the Triple Rings of Light, the description reads, "One of the incantations of Golden Order fundamentalists, a gift from the young Miquella to his father, Radagon." It is no surprise that Miquella would help his father round out the tenets of the Golden Order. As we have mentioned, Miquella is most likely one half of a perfect being, with his intellect being on another level. And while Miquella would walk away from fundamentalism in search of his own answers, Radagon would become devoted to the Golden Order above all else, and I think Loki is spot on one of the reasons why. His study into the fundamentals of the Elden Ring was a study into himself. His obsession with the Order and its supposed perfection would trickle down to his followers, and create the Golden Order fundamentalist hunters, people like Dee. We know that these hunters of death are linked to the fundamentalists in particular because of their associated incantations, such as Order Healing, which reads, "One of the incantations of the Golden Order fundamentalists, used by hunters of those who live in death." This of course makes sense when you consider that Golden Order fundamentalism is breaking down the Golden Order into its most basic form, that is, an order that is absent death. Those who live in death are contrary to that belief, a stain on the purity of this order, and thus these extremists, these hunters, use violence to expunge these errors, these glitches in the perfect order. Radagon is no less extreme in his belief and defense of Golden Order fundamentalism, and thus we see him actually come into conflict with his other half, who has some harsh words for her red-headed reflection.
O Radagon, leal hound of the Golden Order, thou art yet to become me. Thou art yet to become a god.
Marika essentially mocks Radagon for his blind loyalty to the Golden Order, because at this stage, Queen Marika has been pushed to the edge, and clearly wants an end to this era. As we have discussed ad nauseum on this channel, the Bandai Namco story trailer and an accompanying article from Bandai Namco, both released in December 2021, make it clear that Marika is pushed to shatter the Elden Ring because of the slaughter of her progeny during the Night of the Black Knives. To quote the Bandai Namco article, "One grim night, in the depths of winter, a flock of unknown assassins stole across the lands between. In a coetaneous attack, this foul covenant snuffed out the lives of many of the God Queen's kin throughout the Empire, too numerous and too scattered for her godly protection to save. The assassins' targets were multifold, but none was as devastating a loss to the Eternal Queen as that of Godwyn the Golden. After his death, the Elden Ring was somehow shattered, and the order of the world broke with it. Queen Marika was pushed to the edge. The loss of Godwyn was a devastating loss to Marika, and to boot, it was the confinement of the Rune of Death, the very foundation of the Golden Order, that led to the gruesome non-death of her son. After all, it was the stolen Rune of Death that formed the blades that performed the deed, and had death never been confined, this act would not have happened, or at least not in the terrible way that it did. I've always maintained that I do not buy the Marika planned the Night of the Black Knives theory, for numerous reasons that I detail in my Black Knives lore video. But in short, I do believe it was the trauma of witnessing the denigration of her golden son that led her to conclude that the Golden Order was deeply flawed, and a reset was needed. Yet Radagon had found solace and answers in the Golden Order, and we can see that he loved the Golden Order and would actually go against his other half, hence Marika calling him a loyal dog. This is why him and Marika battle for control of their body during the announcement trailer and the intro slides, both of which show Marika and Radagon alternatively coming to the fore, and we know from the description of Marika's hammer that this is because they are fighting for control. One is trying to destroy the Elden Ring, the other repair it. Even in our current time, he is still working from behind the scenes to prevent us from resetting the Elden Ring in a new configuration. And Nea makes it clear that it is not the Greater Will, or the Two Fingers, that deny us access to the Erdtree after we defeat Morgott.
The Erdtree has spurned you. The fingers remain still. Shaken by this turn of events, they are busy consulting the Greater Will.
But upon closer inspection, the true culprit becomes apparent. It is Radagon, as it is his crosshatch sigil that is branded on the vines that block our access. He is trying to hold on to his precious Golden Order and prevent us from rebuilding the Elden Ring in a new configuration, and this comes as a shock even to the Two Fingers and the Greater Will. A great observation was made by Garrulous Goldmask in their recent video on Radagon. In that video, they astutely identify the fact that not only were we blocked from accessing the Erdtree, but also other Tarnished, including Vyke. Vyke's armor set reads the following: no other Tarnished was closer to the throne of Elden Lord than Vyke, but without announcement, Vyke travelled far below the capital and was scorched by the flame of frenzy. Did he make his choice for his maiden, or did some other force lure him with suggestion? So Vyke was the closest to becoming Elden Lord before us, but why did he stop? Well, Garrulous Goldmask suggests that he too was blocked by the vines of Radagon, and this is why Vyke was pushed to become the Lord of Frenzied Flame. Indeed, his armor set suggests that he potentially did it to prevent his maiden from burning herself, as Melina does for us. So the fall of Vyke to the Frenzied Flame and the death of his maiden, who can be found at the Church of Inhibition. So the tragic fate of Vyke and his maiden is again the result of Radagon's actions. So again, shout out and credit to Garrulous Goldmask for making this keen observation that hadn't clicked with me before, and I will link their video below. Moreover, I believe that Morgott, the last king of Leyndell, has unintentionally interpreted the will of Radagon as the will of the Erdtree or Greater Will. Morgott accuses us and the other demigods of being traitors, usurpers.
Thy kind are all of a piece. Pillagers, emboldened by the flame of ambition.
And in his dying moments, Morgott shares with us what he interprets to be the will of the Erdtree.
Tarnished, thou art but a fool. The Erdtree wards off all who deign approach. We are all forsaken. None may claim the title of Elden Lord.
Morgott has spent his kingship as the bulwark against any usurper because he believes that that is the will of the Erdtree. He has hunted people as Margit, he has clashed with demigods, and he has shielded Leyndell during the dark days of the Shattering. Yet the Greater Will does want someone to replace Radagon and ascend the Elden Throne, so in reality, the only person that Morgott has really benefited is Radagon, though one could argue that the Greater Will was happy for Morgott to act as a final challenge for any potential lord. But there is another character who, in my mind, has been more deeply manipulated by Radagon post-Shattering, ironically the person called the All-Knowing, Gideon Ofnir. After spending the game helping us open the way to become Elden Lord, and claiming a desire to be Elden Lord himself, Ofnir pulls a somewhat surprising move last minute to actually block us. He challenges us to a fight to prevent us to become Elden Lord. But not only us, but anyone, including himself. His words during combat give us some clue as to his motivation. He says, "Queen Marika has high hopes for us, that we continue to struggle unto eternity," suggesting that Marika doesn't want anyone to ascend to the throne. He claims to know the mind of Marika and appears to believe that he is acting in her interests. But how? And even if he did, why would he care? Well, the answer is seemingly given to us via his armour set, which reads, "But when Gideon glimpsed into the will of Queen Marika, he shuddered in fear, at the end that should not be." Gideon has been accumulating knowledge, and we even know from the Lord's divine fortification item description that Gideon has had long conversations with the two fingers. And from the myriad of spells that he rewards us with and fights us with, we know he is someone who has sought knowledge from everywhere, forbidden or not. So surely we can assume that in the course of his quest he connected with the Immortal Rebis, Marika Radagon. And as we have clearly illustrated in the earlier chapters, the being that is Marika and Radagon is a cosmic being, an eldritch horror essentially, that harbours the Elden Ring within its very body. Ultimately, it is a being that is beyond our comprehension. Marika clearly does not want us to struggle for eternity, as there is evidence that she wanted to end this current cycle of stagnation. And the main evidence for this is Hugh. We learn from certain dialogues that Hugh has been imprisoned at Round Table Hold to create a god-slaying weapon, and by none other than Marika herself.
"The road is yet long, a god is not easily felled. But one day without fail you will have your wish. So please grant me forgiveness, Queen Marika."
So this is very contradictory to what Gideon believes Marika wants, and as such I would suggest that Gideon did not gaze into Marika's will, but Radagon's. I will reiterate that the Marika Radagon Rebis is a cosmic being beyond our comprehension, and when Gideon connected with this being, I doubt even any words were spoken. What Gideon experienced when connecting with the Rebis must have been overwhelming and terrifying and beyond human comprehension. Indeed, Hugh likewise describes his exposure to Marika as terrifying.
"My being a prisoner is no fault of yours. Besides, I don't mind smithing. Despite my differences, the weapons get stronger all the same. Given time, technique never fails. Besides, it helps me forget the sheer terror of her."
Gideon's aim to block us more easily aligns with Radagon's goals of preventing us from entering the Erdtree. We can definitely interpret this being the will of Radagon, given it is Radagon who blocks us entry to the Erdtree via the thorns and his seal, and the fact that it is Radagon who desperately fights us at the end of our journey. Thus I think Radagon has bent Ofnir to his will, manipulating him, making him believe that it is Marika who communicated to him. So we can see that Radagon does quite a lot to prevent his Golden Order from being replaced. A leal hound indeed. But Marika also has her ace in the hole, us and Hugh. In the end, Radagon couldn't prevent Marika from shattering the Elden Ring. As she reminds him, she is the god form, not he. And in his final battle with us, he also fails to stop us from finally carrying out Marika's wish. We slay the god, and we bring about a new order, whatever that order may be. And thus Marika's revenge on her rogue red-headed half is complete. Before I get to my concluding thoughts on Radagon, I want to address the lore elephant in the room. We touched upon the fact that elements of the Crucible suffered greatly in Radagon's reign, the Omen subjected to a brutal culling or banishment, and the Misbegotten are clearly employed as slaves. The Crucible Scale and Feather Talisman are clear references to the chimeric forms of these creatures, and the description of both leave us in no doubt that these creatures were reviled alongside Crucible Knights and the Omen. However, there are some unusual connections to Radagon that we can't just ignore. In a video called Little Mistakes, Zuli the Witch reveals that internally, the Misbegotten are referred to as children of Radagon. This is even more fascinating when we consider the bright red hair of the lion Misbegottens, as well as the fact that one of their number, a Misbegotten Crusader, wields the Golden Order Greatsword, the personal weapon of Radagon himself. So what is happening here? I did touch upon this in my Hidden Tales lore video, and one thing that I noted there was that the Misbegotten Crusader doesn't wield the sword like a bludgeon, like it simply scavenged the weapon. It appears to wield it with skill, and more importantly, is able to use its Golden Order weapon art, a feat that would require faith, suggesting that this Misbegotten has faith in the Golden Order and Radagon, enough to wield their incantations. The name Crusader is also interesting, as Crusader is usually a holy warrior, aligned with a religion. Indeed, this is reflected in the Japanese also, as Loki translates this closer to holy warrior or paladin, again suggesting that this Misbegotten isn't just wielding this weapon, it believes in the cause that it represents. So my speculation would be this: Radagon harnessed the raw strength of some of these outcasts and used them as his own muscle, his own holy warriors to enact their will, his slave warriors if you will, even arming the most faithful of these servants with his sword. Then upon the collapse of the Golden Order, this Crusader would flee and lead his people to the consecrated snowfields, a new land where they were welcomed by Lord Miquella. As an alternate appendix, Tarnished Archaeologist suggests a different situation, that this Crusader is instead leading a holy crusade against the Erdtree, and the Misbegotten that can be found in Erdtree town are not sheltering there, rather they have attacked and murdered the inhabitants of this tree. And Tarnished Archaeologist's reasons for believing so require quite a lengthy discussion, so I will instead direct you to that lore video. But in essence he suggests that they see the creation of a new tree as heresy. But if this was to be the case, I would still believe that Radagon had a hand in their presence here. The fact the Misbegotten Crusader holds the Golden Order Greatsword and is able to use it is far too strong for me. And perhaps if Tarnished Archaeologist's theory is correct and the Misbegotten are attacking the lands of the Erdtree, perhaps they were encouraged to do so by Radagon, who saw his son's rival tree as a threat to his own power base. But I will leave it up to you to decide your truth. I believe that this Misbegotten Crusader is a holy warrior of Radagon's, and that he used them for his own ends. And with that said, I would also like to take a moment to speak about the Red Wolves of Radagon, or the Wolves of the Champion. In my mind it is clear that these are creations of Radagon. They are named after him, they have his red hair, and they have the ability to use Rayalakarian sorceries. Whether he bred them, genetically engineered them, or created them from scratch is largely irrelevant, as it is clear to me that these beasts were created by Radagon to serve his interests. Let's consider where we find them. Following on from the idea we have just discussed and the Misbegotten, we also find one of these creatures in the consecrated snowfield, and thus it could be accompanying the Misbegotten on their attack on the Erdtree, if you believe this theory, and you could see it as further proof that Radagon has directed the Misbegotten to attack the Erdtree. Or conversely, if you don't believe this, it could simply be guarding his son like a watchdog. Likewise, I believe the Red Wolf in Caria Manor and Rayalakaria are there to protect his old family interests, as well as the one found in Moonlight Altar, a prior holding of the Carians. We know from the Raging Wolf set that wolves are the shadow of the Empyrean. Perhaps this is Radagon's attempt to artificially create his own shadows, and perhaps it's an indicator of Radagon getting too big for his boots, that he saw himself as the true leader of the current age, not Marika, and thus he needed his own shadows to play the role of God. Again, speculation of course, but it is hard not to see the similarities between these Red Wolves of Radagon and the wolves of the Empyrean like Blaidd and Maliketh. This does make me wonder whether the Misbegottens are referred to as the children of Radagon because they are also a creation of his. Radagon is obsessed with the idea of convergence and regression, and these beings are the convergence of many different types of animals in one being, and it may also explain the red hair of the lion Misbegotten, which is very reminiscent of the red fur of the Red Wolves of Radagon. Perhaps Radagon was trying to create the perfect servants, and they didn't come out quite as intended. That is wild speculation, of course. I don't know how I feel about this theory, to be honest, as I do really consider the Misbegotten to be the natural results of the Age of the Crucible. But it is an interesting idea to ponder, and it isn't impossible to consider that Radagon used the effects of the Crucible to do his own research and experimentation. With all that said, let us now wrap up this video. I believe that Radagon is gone, forever slain by us, and all that remains is the White Queen, the material, the vessel, the crumbling remains of Marika that still acts as the embodiment of the Elden Ring, and without her Red King she is merely reduced to material, a clay vessel for our newly repaired Elden Ring. It is a really powerful story, a cosmic being created to be the perfect vessel of the Elden Ring, and to enact its will in a physical and philosophical way, while the other half was occupied with being the actual vessel, the god. But Radagon and his other half, while sharing a physical space, very much were their own characters, and this is what led to the downfall of the Golden Order. The perfect god that was meant to oversee the Elden Ring enacted its sabotage. In this way, we can now understand Goldmask's conclusion on the Golden Order and its failings. The mending rune of the Perfect Order reads, a rune of transcendental ideology which will attempt to perfect the Golden Order. The current imperfection of the Golden Order, or instability of ideology, can be blamed upon the fickleness of the gods, no better than men. The form of the rune itself is interesting in that it isn't really a rune at all, rather a barrier, protecting the Elden Ring from the influence of the gods. Goldmask realised the issue with the Golden Order was Radagon's belief that faith could be bridged with knowledge, that while a fundamental and almost mathematical understanding of the Elden Ring was required, so too was a god, so too was faith. Yet it was these gods, this singular Rebis, who is meant to be the guardian of the Order, that led to its corruption. It was Marika's grief that led to the shattering of Order. It was Radagon's pride that prevented a new Order from taking its place. It was the faith and fanaticism instilled by Radagon's fundamentalists that led to the brutal butchery of innocent death-touched individuals, something lamented by Goldmask himself, as the description of Order healing reads the following. The noble Goldmask lamented what had become of the hunters. How easy is it for learning and learnedness to be reduced to the ravings of fanatics. All the good and the great wanted in their foolishness was an absolute evil to contend with. Does such a notion exist in the fundamentals of Order? And the answer is no. Not if faith and gods were removed from the equation. Had the Golden Order fundamentalists merely been scholars, they would have sought a solution within the Elden Ring itself, much like Goldmask does on his journey. And if you do implement the Perfect Order ending by following the path of Goldmask, Radagon's failure is complete. And this is the real truth of Radagon. I see people naming him as a great villain, and conversely they name Marika as a cold scheming manipulator. But the reality and the issue here is that they were both too human for their purpose. As Loki so poignantly puts it, Radagon was just searching for his own understanding of who he was. Even a being created from a god still needed that understanding of themselves, and thus he looked to the fundamentals of the universe. And his passionate defense of said order is not just a defense of his own power base, but is the defense of a philosophy that was helping him to understand who he was and cope with his existential crisis. For all his godly power and origins, and perhaps because of it, he suffered from the same self-doubt and crisis of identity that any human can. Goldmask was right. The fickleness of gods no better than men indeed. Radagon was a champion, he was a leader, he was a philosopher, who shaped the cultural and religious landscape of the lands between, arguably more than Marika ever did. He was her other half, but in time he became her opposite. If perfection cannot be found in a Rebis, perhaps it cannot be found anywhere, even in Goldmask's perfected order, or perhaps it does exist, in the balance of two twins, one of red hair and one of white, who instead of being forced to coexist, make the choice to work together for the betterment of each other and for all other outcasts, using their strengths to shelter the other's weaknesses. So thanks guys, that is my take on Radagon, the champion and philosopher of the Golden Order. Please consider giving this video a like if you enjoyed it, and if you are not already subscribed and you like Elden Ring lore, then please do. I have hours and hours of content for you to enjoy. But let me know your thoughts in the comments below. What do you think I got wrong? Where do you disagree? And what are your thoughts on the general thesis that we presented today? As well as letting me know what you'd like me to cover next. I am thinking Radahn or a general story overview. But until next time guys, I will see you in the streets of Leyndell. Take care and have a wonderful evening.